Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about the fact that maxing on similar lifts is very specific training to maxing out. Because you'll hear this all the time. You'll see people who will say, well, you guys who do the conjugate stuff, many of whom are elite lifters and have broken many, many world records. People will say, well, it doesn't work because you guys are doing all of these different lifts for maxing, and it's kind of funny when people point that out because the same people will talk about doing technique work at 80%, right, or at 85% on their classic lifts, and then they think that that's going to magically have carryover, and the reality is that's not understanding how the human body works. And I'm not saying these people aren't going to get bigger and stronger from doing it, because they will. Right? I mean, doing heavy squats with enough volume, heavy deadlifts, heavy benching with enough volume will hypertrophy you. It'll increase neural drive also, right? It'll do a lot of those things, but it's not going to create the same technique that's going to carry over to your 1 rep maxes. And I know I tell people that warming up, we should make them look exactly like our maxes, everything else. I say that because we should. But the truth is, they're never going to be the same lift. Okay, so people want to talk about doing different lifts, different exercises. And when we start looking at EMG data, muscle activations change completely. They change completely as the percentage goes up towards 100% 1 rep max. In other words, 93% or 95% of your max is not going to read the same on an EMG as 85% will. And what I mean is the ratios of the muscles involved will be different. All right, you hook an EMG up, as the closer we get to a max, the more tricep gets used relative to the pec, and the other way around. Right, our pec activation doesn't go up to the same degree that tricep does, particularly long head, when ramping is done up and you get closer and closer to a max and hook EMGs up. So if the muscles are not being used the same, the bar speeds are not the same, you're not training the same exercise. And I know that's a little bit much for people to grasp. It's like, what, you're telling me 85% of a max versus 95% of a max on the same movement isn't training the same exercise? No, it isn't. And you want to know what's going to be closer? Would be to use a specialty bar. Like, let's say you're going to work at 95 to 100%. Running chains or bands on your power bar, the same bar you would do for the classic lift, or just switching barbells, is going to actually be closer to your max exercise in terms of the way that it moves, the muscle activation, everything else, then the classic lift will be at 80 or 85%. So your technique work doesn't really mean a lot in terms of specific carryover. If it's teaching you to perform the lift, then hey, great. But it's not going to be a true carryover. It's really not the same thing. All right, maxing out is a skill. Going above 90% 1 rep max for a heavy single is a skill, and it transfers across lifts of similar variation, right, that are very, very similar. Now, one of the reasons we do like this system is because it allows us to be resilient and robust, in the sense of we're used to pushing and pulling against and squatting against bizarre angles. That's why this training style works so well combined with speed work for a lot of contact sport athletes. Why? Because they have to hit and push and pull people at awkward angles. It doesn't matter whether it's a combat sport or American football or rugby. They're all contact sports. Okay, this stuff carries over because, again, people are used to having to grind against an awkward angle, a new one all the time. It's slightly different. You learn how to find your groove and position your body. So it makes it great for those things. What it also makes it really great for is because you do get pushed and pulled at odd angles, and you learn how to find your groove when you're hitting a big classic lift and it tends to get out of its groove. This teaches you to push through anyways, how to refine that groove when the bar gets squirrely or catawampus, to re-get it back into position and keep driving up, because you're used to it always being at weird angles. bands, chains, specialty bars, all this stuff will pull you into weird angles. And if you're used to maxing that way, you keep your calm and you're able to do it. So it helps with both maxing on your classic lift in that regard, and it helps with any sort of contact sport. Any sort of contact sport. But the transfer is there. People always talk about, transfer. Does this carry over? Well, this stuff will always carry over, right? Maxing on an incline bench or a decline bench will still carry over to maxing on your flat bench, right? But it's also going to do so in a way in which you don't burn out as easy. You don't acclimate as easy. You don't get overuse injuries as easy. People want to talk about heavy maxes being dangerous. If you're rotating the lift, the actual overuse risk goes down, because that's really our risk. People will say nonsense like, well, because it's heavy, it's a risk. And if things go bad, you'll get pulled into a bad position. Well, the same thing happens on rep work. And, that's the funniest arguments I've seen people make. I saw one in a conversation I got into with Minnow on his wall, Minnow Henselman. He tries to say that, and I'm like, but if you're working with 70% of your max, and you get close to failure, anywhere near failure, you're going to get pulled into those same weird angles that you do on a missed max. It's the same thing. But people are like, but the weight's heavier. And it's like, okay, but do the math. Let's say you're capable of squatting 500 pounds. All right. Well, that means you're probably capable of doing fairly high reps at 400. You're doing your work sets with 405. And on whatever rep, it gets a little bit squirrely. Do you really think that's less risky to getting hurt than if your 500 does? Yeah, it's less weight, but we're still talking hundreds of pounds. Your risk of injury is no different. That's bullshit. That 95 pounds isn't going to be that big of a difference in the grand scheme of things on you getting hurt. You letting that bar drift into bizarre positions, and by the way, that happens more often on rep work than it does on heavy singles. If you learn to stay tight, which again we do by practicing all these different angles, we learn how to get tight and stay tight. When things go squirrely, what happens? We tend to go straight down. We don't get pulled into the bizarre angles. When you're grinding and you're fatigued and you're getting close to failure and you have technical form breakdown, you get pulled into those weird angles. It's much riskier. So we come back over to the point. Our heavy lifting doesn't have to be on the specific lift that we're doing. It just needs to be a lift that's close enough to get the job done. Okay? And we're going to get all the neural drive and neuromuscular efficiency and intramuscular coordination from maxing on a variation that we would from maxing on the classic lift. And it's just going to help you get stronger. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys next time.